All right. Thanks for the intro, Sally, and thanks everyone for coming. I'm Randy Hale, as Sally said. Kind of an accidental Agile coach of sorts. My first Agile experience dates back to the .com era back in 2000. And I found myself in the late 2000s in multiple scenarios where Agile was of interest and I was the only one around that had any prior experience. And so I sort of got into the coaching role accidentally and really liked it. And then got into the transformation coach role again, somewhat accidentally, and liked it. And I've just continued down that path. I've worked with a number of different organizations of varying sizes, from some really fast growing startups to multiple Fortune 100 companies. And really excited about the conversation we're about to have here, and excited to be joined by my colleague, Marc Story, who I'll let Marc introduce himself and get us going here.
Thanks, Randy. I'm Marc Story, transformation coach at Agile Velocity. A little bit about me. I've been doing this for a long time. I can't claim to be an accidental Agile coach, but I can claim to be an accidental technologist. I went to college for, of all things, fine arts and accounting, and then enlisted in the military. And when I got out of the military, I started working for a telecommunications company, and got just kind of by chance thrown into a web building project where I was the product owner, and really enjoyed that, and really never went back. But throughout my career, I've always kind of crossed between the project management disciplines, product management disciplines, and I even ran a pretty good sized engineering organization. So I've been all over the place, but always really in pursuit of Agile, whether I knew it or not. And this, just in full disclosure, this is my first time being in a consulting role. I've always been the guy on the inside of the company fighting to make things better. So now I'm taking a little different tact at this. All right. And so we're going to talk a little bit here about why change. And most of this is probably not really news to you guys. Things are changing very, very quickly. Disruption due to all kinds of things is happening. Technology is changing. Things like the pandemic or just end up being massive disruptions. But this particular slide kind of shows what's happened to the length of tenure that companies are able to hold in the S&P 500. And this is a pretty good articulation of what that instability looks like. And I got to credit Randy for this. This is his idea, and it's a good one, but it shows how fast things change, and that you can't, just because you get to be a big successful company, that doesn't guarantee you that you're going to continue to be a big successful company. And so with this change, there are also some things that have not changed. If you want to jump slides there, Randy. So things that haven't changed, and these we're probably all very aware of, these leadership beliefs. It's all about getting things going and activity and things like that, management practices, organizational structures, financial planning and tracking. These are things from a different era. They're industrial age things, and they have not changed in a way that really has allowed companies to take advantage or even survive the disruption that's been going on really since kind of the dawn of the internet. And so that's resulted in some really negative things. If you want to go to that really dramatic slide there, Randy. So this is what it is look like, and yeah, this is probably a little overly dramatic in terms of what's happening to a lot of companies and their competitiveness. But the reality is this is exactly what it's looked like to a lot of very large and well-known companies. You go back 20 years, and every single one of these companies had an absolutely dominant market position. A great majority of them right now are gone. Those that are still around, they're not anywhere close to the players that they used to be, and they're struggling to hang on. So you can see, there's plenty of evidence out there that says, hey, what we were doing in the 20th century is not going to continue to work in the 21st century. And so we've got to do some stuff to harness that. And I don't know if you guys have read this book that this talk is based on, but Mick Kirsten wrote this, and it's a really, for me, it really just sort of codified a lot of the way I think about things, which is that we should productize things, and we should focus on just how do we get the most value out of our products. And as people who work in this space, that really kind of becomes our focus, is let's maximize the value and treat our ability to build products or build software, whatever it is that we do, and help that become a competitive advantage and help us keep us on top or get us to the top. And so we're going to talk a little bit about some of the benefits of that. I'm going to turn it over to Randy for this one.
All right. Thanks, Marc. Great tee up. And in full disclosure, Marc and I collaborated to build out this talk as a sort of one-way broadcast webinar. We didn't really design it as such for as much interaction as we normally would like. But that being said, we do appreciate the interaction. So feel free, if you've got a question, feel free to stop us, chime in, and we can have a dialogue as we go. I'm curious, just for a quick poll maybe, and I know we've got most cameras off, so feel free, if you're familiar with the Zoom reactions capability, you can do a thumbs up or the open mouth, right? How many of your organizations are in somewhere between where we are thinking about moving towards a product organization, or maybe farther, taking action? So as long as you're not all the way at a product organization, which I assume you probably wouldn't join this talk if you were, or you're like, nope, we're squarely a project organization and I'm thinking about it, but nobody else is yet. So if you're somewhere in the middle, let's see a thumbs up or raise a hand or a yippee wahoo, hooray for us. All right. We got a couple of reactions there. Okay, so what are some of the high level benefits, and then Marc and I are going to walk through, in a little more detail. From the project organization perspective, if you're in a PMO or serving a leadership role around program management, or interfacing with those kinds of folks, you'll probably see a lot of activity around how do we capture all of the work and who's doing what thing, and how many hours go to which project. And if you're in an environment where, God forbid, you're working on several client things at a time, that can really become even more challenging, right? As an engineer on a team, I have to know that, these 4 different things I worked on this week, I spent 7 hours on this client, and I spent 3 hours on this client, and I spent 20 hours on this client. It gets to be a little crazy. And even if that is your scenario, it's a bit of an outlier, but I know I've worked with a number of companies that is kind of the nature of their work. There are ways to simplify, streamline, and the concept of the product orientation really helps to just take a lot of overhead out of the system and get everybody back and more able to focus on what the heck am I trying to deliver here that is bringing value. The second category here is the reliance on proxy metrics. And in Mick Kirsten, in one of his talks, it might have been the DevOps Summit, I can't remember, it was one of them. He talks about a pretty well-known case study that had some pretty big names in the Agile space involved in this transformation. And the metrics that they were pointing to tout the success of this massive Agile transformation. But these proxy metrics, were things like, how many teams are using Jira? And it probably doesn't, take much for you to react as, as I did, to say, that's really going to be your success measure for how this transformation is going. We've probably all seen some really horrific use of Jira. I've seen some pretty solid use of it. I've seen all kinds of things. But in that proxy metric scenario, you're really lacking the focus on what are the business results that we really want. Let's stop tracking our activity and start tracking the impact that we're having. And Marc's going to walk through some really great ideas and a model around that. And then the third category here is, in a project organization, you tend to have more of a disconnect between IT and the business. The project gets defined, you've got all your requirements, you're expected, there's 100 key requirements. The project is over when requirement number 100 is complete and the thing is ready to launch. And we want to work in much more of a partnership. And part of that is, we may start with an idea that maybe there's 100 requirements, but we might actually start building it only having clarity on what the first 30 or 40 are, right? That's the most valuable thing. Go focus on that. We'll flesh out the rest as we go. And if we're working in a product orientation, those 100 requirements will probably not all ever get completed, because somewhere around 70, 80, 85, maybe 90, we're going to decide, hey, we've delivered as much value as we're going to around this initiative, and we're going to get more bang for our buck to call that one good and shift our focus. So these are some of the things that we're going to dig into. I guess before I jump into some more details, anything that I just shared that raises a question or a reaction? This is why we do webinars. All right. I won't let that stop me from pausing and asking for perspective. So as we were just talking about, one of the big benefits is the improved focus on value delivery. So that sounds great, but it's not always easy. And there are three really key challenges to help us get there. One is lack of alignment on, when you say value, what the heck do you mean? Every organization I've ever worked with, anybody you ask will pretty universally, somewhere between aggressively nod their head and, or at least, mildly agree that, yes, we are all working on the most valuable thing. And yet, if you try to have a conversation with people on different teams or different parts of the organization, they're going to have a very different idea. And you might see the dynamic where you look across at another team and you're like, why the hell are they working on that? That doesn't make any sense. Look at this big pain point this client has over here. We could use them over here. And as long as you have that kind of a dynamic, you're lacking in alignment and understanding. A big part of that, the challenge with the value delivery focus, is on the legacy org structure, right? We've all probably seen varying levels of challenge around, siloed component focus. Like, tell me what the people in my swim lane of my org chart, tell me the work they need to do, and I'll make sure as a leader that all that work gets done. Meanwhile, you're sub-optimizing like crazy, and every time you've got a VP who has that kind of mentality, it's like, well, I don't care. My EVP is measuring me based on what gets delivered by all these people who report up to me. You're really sub-optimizing the ability to come together, form teams, squads around a more product focused orientation. And then the third thing, which is such a simple thing, but just status reporting. Like, how does status reporting work? Who's going to get in trouble based on what's in the status report? What drives the behavior within the organization, you know, so that you can put good things on a status report. Those three areas are really big challenges. And to help kind of, you know, mitigate some of those challenges, there are three approaches that are really helpful in overcoming those challenges. The first one is, in my experience, a really powerful one, and that is, when we say value, let's come up with a model that has us put a value metric of some sort. And for those of you who are familiar with scaled agile, there's cost of delay, and cost of delay is fine. I've used that in a number of different scenarios. I've used other things that are similar in nature but have a little more granularity to them. But at the end of the day, have a model that can facilitate a conversation, especially when you have a group of disparate stakeholders, right? You've got work coming at you. You've got work coming at you from multiple directions. Imagine a world where all the people throwing work in your funnel sat down together and collectively, collaboratively figured out what the value of all the items were, and they're rating each other's items. When we talk about the alignment challenge, having a collaborative value attribution approach, in my experience, is one of the greatest sources of, you know, pulling inertia out of your system, and stopping, you know, a lot of the kind of escalations and infighting that can happen. So at least experimenting with something along those lines would be a great first step. The second thing that probably should be the first thing is defining what are your products. And this can be a challenge. I've had this challenge with clients who have taken a look at their tech stack, and from a technology stack and a set of applications perspective said, oh yeah, we defined all our products, but their products are all just like a different packaging and formulation of, like, you know, groupings of components. They're not actually oriented at, you know, towards who are the end users, who are the consumers of, you know, the things that we build. And that's what you really need to ultimately to be successful. And then the third thing is really to optimize end to end. And so what I shared earlier with that whole notion that if we're, you know, looking at our own silo, that's the wrong focus. We want to be able to look at, from a really broad perspective, what does it take for us to take, you know, an articulation of a customer or a user need, and get that from idea through implementation, and be able to optimize that overall flow, that overall system, if you will. That is extremely important. So I'll pause for a moment before I go into the next section. Again, any comments, reactions, ideas, any input is welcome here. And of course, as a coach, we're extremely comfortable with the uncomfortable silence to create space.
Curious if anyone is trying to get something like this started at their company or with a client.
I'll chime in that I agree with this completely, and I think that the bit about getting the group of stakeholders together to attribute the value collaboratively, that has been, I think, a really key message, and where I've been successful with teams, and especially where you've got folks who understand prioritization, they can empathize with the other folks and they can actually see where their stuff fits in. And they may know what's important in their world, but they could also look and see the bigger picture, and it gets them on the same page. You don't have to explain that.
Yeah, that's a great point, Todd. I think one of the big things there is if you get, like if you take the sort of silos that Randy was talking about, and you put leadership from those silos in the same room and you make them talk about the same list of things, the net result of that is that you're essentially going to create free capacity within your company by creating that alignment and eliminating duplicative work or work that semi overlaps or low value work. And so I won't say it's easy, but it's a process that is relatively straightforward to start. And I have found over the years that people are pretty open to engaging in that sort of conversation.
Too often the stakeholders even don't have awareness to the other work that's coming at you. Yeah. And they might see, wow, that is actually a real needle mover that other guy's doing, and mine, while it's important to me, maybe won't move the needle. Or they could collaborate together and see where there's synergies.
Yeah, and I always kind of look at this like when you're planning your own stuff. I think that's sort of the equivalent of looking at the world through a straw. Is you get a very narrow view of things, and so you got to get that straw out from in front of your eyes and take a broader look to it. And this is one of those things that can do that.
Yeah, I like what you just said, Todd, too, because if they can't do that, that needs to be looked at as a very strong indicator of a pretty powerful system dysfunction, if you will, right? Like you've got these VPs, and like you can't have one VP stand up and say, yeah, that is a more important thing. We should do that and not do my thing. Because I know VPs who are no longer in the role they're in because they did that. And it didn't work out very well for them. And, I would say it's probably their boss that came down on them that's the one that should no longer be in their position. But that's a whole nother conversation.
Thanks.
Okay. The second area is simplified execution. And I touched on a couple of the concepts, but the challenge is to simplified execution. The first one we're calling out here is the business partners as your customer, right? Rather than your partner. Like the folks in your organization who are representing like the business perspective, who are speaking for your end customers or for a group of users that you're trying to serve their needs. They're not your customer. You guys are all in this together, or certainly should be. And so finding ways to work, more kind of arm in arm than treating them, as sort of an arm's length customer of sorts is a really pervasive challenge. The second is funding governance. And, I'll never forget one of the first really big Agile transformations that I was a strategy lead of for a Fortune 100 organization. The leaders basically said, if we get one benefit out of doing all of this, it will have been worth it. And that benefit is our current way of working is all around projects and funding of projects. And if we take our eye off the ball and we end up with, a couple of projects that are ramping down at the same time and we don't catch it early enough, we've had situations where we've got people who have been engaged, who like know our systems, who are, very valuable team members. They might be, solution providers or partners or consultants or contractors, but, a lot of organizations, have a very hybrid model that, doesn't have all full-time employee people doing the work. And like, they would just lose those people because the funding dried up before they, were able to get another project spun up. And of course, like if you're a consultant or a service provider, like, sure, maybe you can have your people sit around for a week or maybe two, but like, that's your business. Like if you've got another client that you can roll them over to, that's going to happen. And like, this was like the biggest pain point for the leaders in this organization. They said, it could take most of our cycles for a month to try and just get everything lined up, get all the governance approvals, get all the contracts signed again. And it's all around that, project-centric funding cycle. And then the third thing is legacy roles and responsibilities, which probably goes without saying, but one of the things, the sort of paradigms that we find is helpful is to think about when we're making a shift and doing something new, let's be very clear on the model that probably will sound very familiar, but just a different context is what's the stop, start, continue here. And it's not what are we doing well, what are we doing poorly, right? Like what are we, those kinds of things. It's what new things are we going to do with this model? And in contrast to that, what things are we going to stop doing? Are we going to stop reporting? Are we on time? Are we on budget? Can we start doing, like a value velocity kind of a metric? Hey, how much value did we deliver, this last quarter? How much value are we planning to deliver next quarter? Versus, hey, we've got these 80 projects and, we've got, a certain percentage of them are, on time, on schedule, on budget, and others are behind. Let's change what we're focusing on and change the conversation. I always like to say, we want to provide different information in different contexts, but along with that, we want leaders asking different questions. And that's a really important thing. And so where do we start around, this notion of simplifying execution? So the first thing from that business and IT, partnership is define the new ways of working together. If you're in the technology organization and you're trying to come up with, hey, here's the whole operating model and how it's going to work, and we're going to define everything. And once we feel like we've got it all buttoned up, then we're going to go to our business partners and say, hey, guess what? Here's how we want you to work with us now. Well, that's kind of crappy, right? Like you totally are just, bringing this change and, laying it down as if it's an edict, right? And it's like, well, here's how you need to work with us. What if you sat down with them and said, hey, we have a notion that if we can work more and more in this manner, this is our true north, this is the direction we want to go. We know it's going to be challenging for you and us. Can we sit down and figure this out together? Like, I don't care what conversation you're having, if you approach it like from that perspective, probably 9 times out of 10, you're going to have a much better outcome. And treat them as a partner. The second item here is re-architect funding models and reporting. And we want to get away from this notion of project-centric funding. For me to get people to do work on something, I have to jump through like these 5 key hoops that basically unlock some level of funds. We want to simplify that. We want to provide more, product funding. A lot of times it's called bucket funding, but, instead of having, 80 projects with an average, project size of 75K, what if we just had, 5.6 million to go, hey, go deliver the most value you can with this 5.6 million. I think the math I did there roughly works out. And now that does mean, there's some different practices and certainly a level of trust and competency that goes along with that. But you start to strip out. There was a client that I worked with that did the analysis, and they had their one part of their portfolio that they looked at was I think it was in the neighborhood of 30 million, something like that. But they took a look and they figured that they had close to 10% of their portfolio spend was on overhead activities. Activities around, we've got these 80 projects, right? Every month, we've got things that we have to do to report on, like, what's our burn on the spend on this? Are we behind? Are we ahead? How are we doing on scope? Like all the work that has to go in on that, those things still happen in a product organization, but they happen very differently, and they happen with a lot lighter, overhead of activity. So those things really provide some major opportunities. I mean, imagine if you could get 10% more, testing and engineering horsepower behind the work you're doing, what that might mean. And the third thing here is redefining roles collaboratively, whether it be, business roles, but even, technology focused roles. And, it could be things like the role of a technology manager. We've got people in manager roles, in the legacy org structures that have a lot of responsibilities and accountabilities, many of which are extremely valuable and extremely important, but many of which are not. We don't need, people managers, if you will, setting the priorities on who does what work, right? If anything, we could get more impact out of those people if we take that from them, put that responsibility in somebody who's much more business centric in their focus. And at the end of the day, everybody should be happier from that perspective. So those are the first couple, and Marc's gonna talk about improved insight of control of flow.
Yeah, and I was just going to add a humorous little anecdote to the discussion about funding. A place that I used to work, which will go unnamed, had a technology budget of $104 million. And I had to do all of the project budgeting for that. And we got an edict that we would cut 5% from that budget. So we spent from September through February going through that effort, and we conservatively estimated that we spent $3.5 million producing the budget. So we could have almost met the goal by doing absolutely nothing. And then what really makes it a kicker is that the money didn't get spent the way we planned on spending. So it's just that's a zero-sum game at best. So we're going to talk next a little bit. This is how we. Oops. So we'll talk. We go back a couple there, Randy. Oh, that's the next slide. Okay, I'm off. Go ahead, please. So we're going to talk a little bit about how we can start getting better visibility into what's actually happening. And this is in that slide early on where we started talking about moving from proxy metrics to metrics that actually demonstrated business results. There's plenty of things that get in the way of that. And I probably should have put status quo as the first one, because that's always the challenge. People are used to looking at things a certain way, and holy cow, ask them to look at something different and they cannot deal with it. But we can go back to that idea that we talked about earlier, is that customer value isn't universally understood. Organizations haven't gone through that process to say, what is valuable to our company, what is valuable to our customers, and where should we be spending our time? And so without that, it becomes very difficult to start understanding what's actually happening with these things. We also don't speak the same language. People want to talk about a user story, how many user stories we did, how many points we did we reach a certain milestone, stuff like that. we don't care. We really don't care about these things. And so the idea that we start shifting to and looking at a product model is only measuring the outcomes of whatever our factory is. If we're building products or whatever it is, we only care about the outputs. And so that's where we're going to start measuring it. And then the other thing is limiting work. I would venture to guess that we have all, probably I would bet actually that we're all living in an environment right now where there is more work than we can possibly do. That's just the way it is. And people are so concerned with getting things started that they lose sight of actually getting things finished. And so we need to start limiting work in order to increase the throughput of what we're doing. And so if you just skip ahead there, Randy. And so where we want to start on this is back. So now we're getting some common themes here. One, we want to define value. We want to understand how we get value so that we can start seeing which activities produce value and which don't. And guess what? We want to get rid of the things that don't produce value. We want to measure what matters. And then back to that idea of we want to measure outputs. What are we actually getting for our effort versus how many projects we're working on or how many user stories were completed, things like that. And then we're going to bring in this concept of flow distribution, where we're going to talk about, and we'll go into that in a little bit more detail about what are the kinds of things that we're actually building. And then doing all these things then gives us the ability to essentially budget what we want to output and compare what it is that we're putting out to what we wanted to do. All right, and now we'll talk a little bit about project to product, because this is the flow framework, and it's very deep. If you guys are familiar with this, there's all kinds of things that we could talk about. So what we're going to do is we're just going to talk about this very top here, which are the flow metrics and flow distribution. And so the four flow or the four things that we want to measure in flow distribution is features. These are the things that typically most companies are kind of obsessed with. We want new features. We want new widgets. That's the kind of thing. And that's great. That's why we're in business. But we also have to deal with things like defects, things where systems don't perform as they're expected. We also have to deal with risks. And Peter, I know you said you work in security. This is your land here. Is we want to make sure that we're putting enough risk reduction work into our pipeline so that we're maintaining a healthy ecosystem. And then that same thing goes toward technical debt. And the way debts are described in the flow framework is slightly different than we typically think of as technical debt, where we might think that old code is technical debt or a defect is technical debt. What we're looking at here is the only kind of debts we're talking about here are those which, when we build them, we will be able to accelerate our flow. And so those are really the kind of things that architects are going to pull into the system. And these each have really their own kind of customer group that pulls these. Features have end users, defects have quality teams, risks have governance, risk, compliance. Those are the kind of people that are pulling those things in there. And then architects, they're the ones that are lobbying for debts because they speed up our ability, they increase our overall flow. So any questions on those concepts? I know the debt one kind of gets people sometimes. All right, let's continue on. All right, and so this is what a flow distribution chart would look like. And if you're familiar with lean at all, you know, if you know what lead time and cycle time are, those are only measured on completed items. This is the same concept, is what was completed from each of our flow categories in each of these 12 months. And there are actually a number of things that you can get into. We can look at this pattern, and like if we look at months 1 and 2 and 3 and 4, there was a pretty high allocation of new features. But then we can see a correlation in later months where defects went way up and risks went up. And so those are the kind of things that companies want companies to be able to make those decisions intentionally, understanding what the ramifications are. meaning that if you decide to invest only in new features, you're eventually going to have a defect backlog that you're going to need to address, which will then limit your ability to build new features. And so this is a way that you can measure the overall health of what your system architecture is. All right, so any questions on the flow framework or flow distribution before we move on to the next one? All right, and so this is actually measuring these things is actually a very good place to start, because putting these in place, if you use Jira or Rally, you can make one of the flow categories an attribute of both features and user stories. And so you can measure them, like if you put it on a feature, you can get it to cascade to all the user stories. And then you can just measure how many of those flow items were completed in a really simple way. Yeah, back to you, Randy.
All right. And so benefit number 4 that really flows out of all of these is more highly engaged employees. You know, you get a lot of the overhead, as it were, inertia out of the system, as it were, and you get employees feeling like, wow, you know, we're closer to the customer. We understand what's going on. We understand how the work we do impacts our customers and our users. And yeah, that's a fantastic thing. So with that, we want to tee it up for Q&A. We've got a little bit of a recap of the first slide here, recap on like what are the top areas to focus on, and just kind of sharing what else we've got here. A little bit about Agile Velocity before Q&A. That's as a company, it's kind of one of our unofficial taglines. We don't really use this officially in our marketing, but it's basically the last Agile transformation you'll ever need. And we have a proven framework. It's called Path to Agility. We've got a number of resources. This is one of the fun things that back in the old world, when we used to all get together in the same conference room and work on things, we would utilize these cards. But there's a model that really highlights what are all the pieces you need to have in place to be successful, and really help, you know, shine a light on the big picture. What are the conversations we really need to be having with leaders? And our goal is to help organizations get as quickly as possible to a new sustainable status quo. And that's as much of a company commercial as I'll do. But yeah, do want to open it up for Q&A. What questions do you have? What, you know, reactions do you have? What do you have for us?
Hey, this is Peter. Hey, I had a quick question about just in terms of when you're talking about going from project to product, and we were talking about the different you know, things to measure against, you know, in terms of the features, defects, and things like that. A lot of organizations, when they start to make this step to, you know, move everyone into this organization, yeah, or changing the way that they're going to do this, what's kind of like the first thing that kind of is looked at in terms of making sure that, because you're not going to just do it overnight, right? It's like it's a gradual thing, and there's a lot of change management that's involved in convincing others and so forth. If you could explain a little bit about that.
Yeah, and I sort of alluded to it earlier, but really one of the first steps is defining what your products are. You know, without that understanding and orientation, it's really difficult to know what you're ultimately trying to optimize for. And, you know, in most organizations, when I go in, you know, and I think, you know, we probably, most of us see this, like, and I'll give a little bit of backstory. So the backstory is every organization is a representation of some strategy, or perhaps even multiple strategies. But when we think about technology, and we think about technology back, you know, like I started my career in '89. Technology was, at least at that point, pretty widely looked at as a cost center. What is your organizational strategy for a cost center? You want to control costs. And so all of these org structures that, you know, have proliferated through all these years have largely been predicated on a cost optimization strategy. And as Marc teed up, if you look at all those companies, they probably had all kinds of really positive indicators on all their dashboards right up to the point where they're out of business, right? Because if you're measuring the wrong thing, like, are you measuring your ability to create an impact for your customers and your users, like, depending on what the focus is? That's what your products are there to do. Your products are there to make a customer's life easier or better, or to make your user's life easier or better. And if you are 3-4 steps removed, and you can't even make the hops to understand how, you know, what we're doing in, you know, this, you know, not to pick on him, but, you know, let's just say it's like the microservices team, right? We're the microservices team. What do you guys do? We build microservices that all the applications use. Well, how are your services? You know, it's like, you know, a little bit about it. I've worked in organizations where we got leaders to buy in and said, hey, what if we put, you know, these mobile people and these front end people and these UX people and these services people and these database people on the same team, because we had this compelling need to go build this thing, and we didn't have a whole lot of lead time. And if we didn't get this thing done in the next 3 months, it was going to be another year before it came around again. Hey, cool, we got a really compelling purpose. Let's go put all these people on the team. They go knock something out in literally, it was a pretty core feature set, and it was pretty close to production ready in 3 sprints. And in their you know, prior legacy structures, there's no way they would have gotten there like in less than probably two months. But, you know, you do things like that, and you help them see, you know, like, this is a product, this is a product team. Everybody's working on the thing that's, you know, very close to, you know, the customer need. So at the risk of monologuing, I think that's where to start. And Marc, I'd love to hear your thoughts.
I would agree. Not in the making sure that you define value. Kind of drawing boundaries around specific products can be a relatively long process, because there's not really a scientific method to doing it. You got to try a few things and get it right. But you can definitely get people in a room and have a conversation and make sure you're clear on what your value proposition is. And Peter, I'm going to go back to the conversation we were having before we started about that engineering team I led at Comcast. Is we used to build features as directed by our customers. But once we had a discussion about what our value proposition was, which was to get on-demand ready content as close to real time as we could, that drove all kinds of different things, because then the entire team understood how we produced value. So it's that's a great start. And then I think second to that would be to start comparing work across product lines, however you want to detail, however you want to kind of describe that, is but get as many people in the room as you can and compare what each other is doing and say, hey, this one thing is 6 times as valuable as the item number 2. We should probably do item number 1. And so I would just take it as those as pretty not easy steps, because none of this is easy, but I think they're the most direct route to start to realize some of these benefits.
Thank you both for the answer there. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you. Great question.
Hmm.
Anybody else? All right. Go Broncos.
I'm gonna stop the recording. If I can find it.